Continuing Chapter 4, Zarathustra in the outside world, from The Treasure of the Magi, a study of modern Zoroastrianism by James Hope Moulton. That will add a good illustration to a useful principle, which is that which we have two related stories before us, it is easy to combine them in phraseology, suiting both to admit characteristics which would dilute the similarity. The finding of the highest common factor is a process belonging to elementary mathematics, and its literary analog is equally elementary, though practiced by not a few scholars who seem to think that they are doing something rather profound. Now, in this story, we may dispel the sense of really significant parallelism by merely telling it in its independent forms. In the Avesta, combining early and later notices, King Yima, who in Aryan antiquity had been the first man, but was no longer, gives to his subjects portions of beef which seem to represent the flesh of the primeval bull, the eating of which, at the regeneration, is supposed to bestow immortality. His doing this was apparently an act of presumption inspired by the Devas, to whose lies he yielded. Oh, well, it's literally true with Christianity, right? I think that's the point that he's saying. But the devil, the idea that these Christian ideas of theology of transubstantiation in terms of God really being incarnate and that sort of thing, the way of interpreting death is most closer to the hero. Okay. In Genesis, it is the first woman who gives to her husband the fruit of the forbidden tree, and it is not this tree which confers immortality, but another, from touching which Adam and Eve are prevented by being driven out of paradise. Now, of course, the conception of a food of immortality is found among many unrelated peoples, and the mere fact that fruit is a substance not at all easily confounded with the fat of the urku is enough to dispose all probability that either religion borrowed from the other. Both religions have a doctrine of heavenly beings that kept not the first estate. The Devas, we are told, chose not aright between the twain spirits, for infatuation came upon them as they took counsel together, so that they chose the worst thought. Yasna 36. Combining this with the fact that the Devas were once Deva, heavenly beings. No, they were always, it was one language used a similar term for the opposite. Well, not quite the opposite, light being versus fire being, but we see that the real meaning of it depends on the perverse choice made by the Dava Yasna, the worshippers. Well, you'd put an S at the end of that if it's plural. The worshipper of the old nature entities of the Aryans, who refused to accept Zarathustra's reform that rushed together to violence that they might enfeeble the world of men. They raided the forms of the prophet's peaceful agriculturalist and tried to extinguish the new faith in blood. We have in Israel the degeneration of the Baalim, the same passage of a word from God to devil, but there seems no other connexion. The fall of the angels is a quite conspicuous doctrine in Israel. Well, particularly on the Christian side, you do have mention of the beings of fire and the Malak. They're different, but in the Christian understanding, you can't tell the difference between in terms of matter and that sort of thing. Well, I mean, they don't have the same matter as this material world, but you know what I mean. where it seems to have been attributed to ambition, as recalled in Shakespeare's familiar words, or to lust, based on Genesis 6. In either case, the doctrine starts on quite different lines than those of the Gatha. Another very important subject in which the Jews have been supposed to be borrowers is the doctrine of the future life. Here, there is no question that Zarathustra taught an ethical system of rewards and punishments in the hereafter, ages before the Jews had emerged from their ancestral belief in their colorless Sheol, a barely conscious existence in which there is no remembrance of God. We have seen, moreover, that the resurrection as preached in the last generation, BCE, was a doctrine in all essential features parallel with Zarathustra, taught a millennium earlier. In most respects, it might have been taken from him if we could only show how. The dates fit well, for it was a few generations after the return from Babylon that the Jews first began to realize the great hope for the first time. And, it was one of the tribes, but being the surviving tribe, well, some Levites, right? But, then Judaism kind of formed as a... And yet, it does not seem possible to believe that the Jews got an impulse from their neighbors during captivity. We might probably go so far as to suppose the Jewish thinkers were simulated to search their own scriptures afresh when they found that the compatriots of Cyrus held a doctrine of a future life which did not repel their instincts of morality. And that's also one of the things, is that the Judaism, as ruled by the Ha-Kahanim, didn't really, you can't really say that it's anything other than let's restructure things according to how things were in Persia, because they could do it. So rather than being, a bunch of forbidden cults, you actually had a Judaism, an ethnic identity that kind of put that. Nothing can be clearer that Jewish thought came to the great venture by a very different road. The Magi believed in immortality because death was so palpably the creation of Ahriman, and immortality, therefore, of Ormazd. Zarathustra believed it because he knew that God was just, and therefore the righteous must be recompensed in another world for the unmerited sufferings of this. Jewish saints came to believe it because they had learnt the preciousness of communion with God and realized that he could not possibly abandon to extinction the child of his love. It seems, therefore, that in all things that really matter, we have no adequate grounds for believing Jewish ideas indebted to any outside source which can be connected with the Avesta. Well, if you tied a century before, and you really can't say Zoroastrianism is, if not the most influential faith, of the most influential faiths. If you believe in, if you don't believe of one religion theory, Zoroastrianism is second only to the Yezidism, which is, much older. This conclusion is independent of another line of inquiry which must be undertaken before we could prove that even the most convincing parallels were due to real contact. We need to show that the ideas of the Avesta could have access to the Jews at the time under review, and that is extremely difficult to prove, for the one part of the Avesta which is permanent religious value, for one of the many bewildering problems attaching to the great name of Zarathustra is the fact that his doctrine ran aground through so many centuries. This fact was at the basis of James Dermasteter's impossible theory. A man so great and so uniquely acquainted with the facts was not likely to propound a revolutionary hypothesis without some sort of basis. We may confess that, without ever feeling the slightest temptation towards Darmester's reading of the evidence, we may have been more and more impressed with the strangeness of the phenomena on which the great Orientalist based his view. The attempt to find footprints of Zarathustra on the sands of a dozen centuries nearly always ends in disappointment. Can we suggest a reason, and can we reconstruct the picture of Zarathustra as it appeared to his avowed followers during the ages which open with the Gatha of 7 chapters and end with the Sassanian reform? In attempting to answer these questions, we shall assume the discussions which fill a large part of early Zoroastrianism. This consideration is recalled, lest we should be supposed to be advancing mere guesswork without proofs. Why, then, have we so little sign of the genuine Zarathustra as depicted in the Gathas during all those ages? The answer is really very simple. In the thoroughly characteristic features of his system, Zarathustra was far above the heads of his contemporaries. We have to wait some centuries before the Iranian aloe flowed again, if, as Dr. Spooner makes it extremely probable, Gautama the Buddha was the Iranian monk Chakya Muni. We may recognize, after perhaps half a millennia, a religious thinker in Iran, rather broadly defined, who may be regarded as Zarathustra's intellectual and spiritual peer. In the other branch of the easternmost Aryan family, we must look at the circle that produced the Upanishads before we find anything comparable. It is not at all surprising, therefore, that long after the prophet's disappearance from the scene, where his powerful personality had impressed his teaching on people who came under the spell, there was a virtual return of the beliefs current among his contemporaries. The 7 chapters Gatha is sufficient evidence that this was so. It may be quite possible to accomplish a religious synthesis by which the later Avesta will fit into the system determined by the Gathas, but it must start from the presumptions which nobody could deduce from the Yashts by unaided reason. If we agree to postpone this synthesis till the Sassanian reform, we are free to take the Yashts at their face value, as hymns of a nature religion very much like those of the Veda, only superficially accommodated to the stern and lofty monotheism of a prophet already lost in the midst of antiquity, and a philosophy too profound for his own or subsequent ages. With this key to our problem, we may proceed to ask what the last 10 centuries or so for the Sassanians thought of Zarathustra or knew of his teaching. At first, as to his personality, one of the very few legends about the prophet which have early attestation concerns his laughing on the day he was born. It is as old as Pliny the Elder, and may probably be recognized a century before this in the famous messianic eclogue of Virgil. It is most interesting in that it preserves the impression of a teacher who took an optimistic view of life, and this is, of course, one of the most outstanding features of the historical prophet, who was veritably an Eastern Democritus, and much more, a man who based his whole system on the unshakable conviction that truth is great and will prevail. We should remember what foils there were to such a doctrine of faith in the early Indo-Iranian world. Between Zarathustra and Gautama, the theory of rebirth, Panarjanma, cast its baleful shadow over life in India and perhaps some part of Iran, putting aside all question of its adequacy as to an interpretation of the riddle of existence. It may be presumed that no one will deny the profound sadness with which it enshrouds the present and the future life. Consciousness is a nightmare, out of which the sleeper only desires to escape into slumber, for ever untroubled with dreams. In the sharpest possible contrast to this gloom, which was to afflict the meditative East for ages, our great thinker proclaimed a radiantly optimistic theory of life based on an initiation, based on an intuition. Well, same thing, right? That God is one, and that God is good, and that he can never be conquered by evil, nor allow his obedient children to lose the bliss prepared for them. It was a most significant instinct which fastened on this as the central trait of a great teacher who saw life from the first as a beautiful and gracious gift from God. Well, if God's one, how's the Trinity fit into that, Mr. James Hopes Moulton? Apart from this individualizing trait, we may sum up the general impression of Zarathustra as centered on his fame as a matter of occult lore. Well, all religion's occult because it's connecting into the unseen realms. This may be largely accounted for by his association with the Magi, long recognized as adepts, which is where the term magic comes from, as they're skilled individuals. And the definition of magic is as the art and science of religion. That definition fits in very well with that one. But the classical notices of the prophet suggest something more, and it is good that we should be able to base our conceptions on something more reliable than claims of the Magian clan to have produced the great leader, whose doctrines they took under their charge. Now, there's linguistic reasons why the 1700 BCE to 2000 BCE language of the Avestan indicates that Zarathustra could have been older, because the etymology of his name and some other aspects make it sound like, just like parts of the Bible, they were translations and reworkings or summations of older documents, some which we know took more space than the Bible did. So there were reasons in that tradition too. It was really a dim remembrance of actual truth that had been preserved. Zarathustra, as we read him today, is the founder of apocalyptic, a literary genre which was destined to take a very prominent place in the late Jewish and early Christian writings. Visions of a future lying wholly in the spiritual world was so characteristic of him that we can readily understand its preservation as a note of his personality, where all details of his teaching had disappeared. Now, actually, if you trace some of the at least 40,000-year-old portions of Vedic culture, you're going to have to say that this sort of talking definitely existed among their that which may be older than that. I don't think that exists amongst the strands that talk about even older periods with even details that you wonder how they would have known it without somehow passing down through early humans into more modern humans. Vision of a future lying wholly in the spiritual world was so characteristic of him that we can readily understand its preservation as a note of his personality, where all details of his teaching had disappeared. The Magi, who were astrologers and diviners of dreams, easily attached themselves to this, which was really very different, and the popular etymology, by which the second element in Zarathustra's name was supposed to mean star, heightened the association. A great sage skilled in white magic, well, beneficial change of consciousness, we might say, and gifted with powers of insight into futurity, was naturally supposed also to have had special relations with the deity. The legend of his goddess bride and entertainment at the table of a supreme deity, which seems to lie behind the mysterious passage at the end of the fourth Eclogue of Virgil, answers to the stories of his colloquies with Ahura Mazda, so prominent in the later Avesta, and the miraculous generation of the Xiaoshuns. And we're kind of reminded of the Holy Grail and the Sacred Platter thing there, and you have the reference in Isaiah to don't worship God and Mani. Yeah, God is actually the name of something they're telling you not to worship. But again, like the Dava and Ahura, Devi and Asura bit, the German tribes and their god. They were a very no. I mean, you know, that you can't say, oh well, this is so similar to this, so therefore this. They're different languages, you know. But definitely the polytheism of the mother and father god was not part of Zoroaster's thing. They were a very easy effort in myth-making when the Magian priest sought to expound and enforce the fact of the prophet's intimate knowledge of the future and the will of God. The birth of the Shaoxians is even more obviously explicable. In the Gathas, Zarathustra is evidently penetrated with the powerful conviction that the renovation to preach was his divine call, which would come within his lifetime, and he himself would, with his faithful helpers, have the privilege of bringing it in. They would accordingly be Shaoshants, men that are to deliver the world. But when the prophet died and his own immediate followers, and all things remained as they had been from the beginning of creation, we cannot wonder that keen faith persisted in connecting with him the still future blessing to be achieved by those who would be vitally connected with the great preacher. With all this naturally came a conviction that Zarathustra was supreme as a priest, a pioneer performer of the ceremonies which the Magi had made central in the religion. In the Home Yasna 9-11, the least damaged piece of verse in the later Avesta, and therefore presumably among its oldest poems, Zarathustra's father is given the fourth place among those who prepared the sacred drink and won for reward the happiness of distinguished sons. It is rather suggestive that the old folklore heroes Yima, Thrataana, and Keras are all described in practically perfect verse, and the material is of the popular kind, which could be detached from the brewing of Hyoma without anyone's missing it. As soon as Zarathustra's corresponding exploit comes to be set forth, the verse at once begins to halt. The indication might mean little in itself, and with some ingenuity in emendation and the striking out of glosses, we might perhaps enable the lame to walk. But even so, it is curious that so large a proportion of verses need one or other of the two expedients in the practice of Procrustes, and suspicion becomes confirmed when we note that from Yima, the lord of an earthly paradise, Thrataana, a typical St. George the dragon, and Kerisaspa, concerned in the very common folk story of mariners mistaking a sea monster's back for an island, we have suddenly stepped into a new world, the all too familiar world of the priest and the master of spells. The grandeur of the prophet of righteousness is out of sight. The beauty of the Honover is lost in Zarathustra's great discovery that the formula is to be chanted 4 times, with proper attention to the pauses, and the second part with emphasis in recital. Such is the easy downward path along which religions glide to self-satisfied nullity. So-called pagan folklore kept its place all the time that the language was truly living and capable of free use in the old verse forms. Sacerdotalism comes in with its contribution when verse was becoming a lost art, and the Avestan language was no longer the tongue of the people. Was there anything of Zarathustra's genuine teaching that lived on during these dark ages of the Parsi faith? A priori, we should expect some of the easier doctrines to survive, just because of the impact made by the prophet's personality. Men might not fully understand him, and when his presence was withdrawn, they might well slip back easily into the familiar beliefs he had superseded, not from want of reverence to him, but simply because his thought was too high for them. But since it is clear that the deepest veneration for his memory lived on, so that his figure, wreathed in the clouds of forgotten antiquity, became the very type of a mysterious Eastern sage who had accessed divine realities unknown to lesser men, we might reasonably expect to find his favorite words and phrases current long after his day, even after their original and deeper meaning was largely forgotten. And this is exactly what we do find. His great triad of word, thought, and deed attains a fixed position and even passes on into Buddhism and Jainism. Indeed, in this case, it was not a mere catchword that survived. Much of the spirit of this profound innovation by which man stands before God in the light of his own inmost thoughts, and not merely as pictured by deeds men can see and words they can hear, remained as a permanent heritage of Parsi teaching, even if its implications were not very fully realized. Then something remained of the doctrine of the Ameshaspans. In this case, what remained was of comparatively little value. The 6 supreme attributes of God had been isolated and specially named as early as the Gatha of 7 chapters. Zarathustra was so constantly talking of them that it would have been a miracle if they had been forgotten by anyone who held his memory sacred. But it is more than doubtful whether their names meant anything. They were only admitted to the circle of the Yazata, perhaps placed above them as a sort of an archangelic college. Well, there's a difference between them, but if any particular ideas were associated with their names, they would be those of the material realms. Their inherited title, to which Zarathustra perhaps rather grudgingly allowed them to retain, Bohu Mano, if Strabos Cappadocian Omanus is to claim identification, was worshipped as a golden calf or something of the kind, and in the same country, Ameratat seems to have been embodied in an image that shared processions with Omanus. Well, the old polytheisms and worship with idols and stuff crept in, but the Zoroastrians were called fire worshippers by the ignorant because people expected idols and stuff in the temples, and they just stood around the fire praying. Well, they stood before the fire, but we meet with the names of the Meshaspans in the Cappadocian calendar and on the Indo-Scythian coins. Indeed, the nomenclature of Persian court circles in Achaemenian days might quite possibly be linked with those characteristic conceptions of Zarathustra by something more than coincidence. The prominence of Arcta as an element in royal and aristocratic names might well be connected with the thought as well as the name of Asha, but none of this amounts to any proof that the Ameshaspans, as Zarathustra conceived them, survived him, except in name. It is only our present-day scientific study of the Gathas that has restored these dim abstractions to the lofty place they hold in the prophet's theology. Yeah, people started worshiping whatever, all sorts of entities after he died, and it's obviously not the same faith. But like Christianity, where does the Bible say that Jesus is claiming to be any different in sonship or anything that you'd have to worship him. It's like one person the only person to call him Son of God to his face and mean it in a more literal sense, exorcism, and the other person, and then he predicts what he's going to say to those who do things in his name, and there's enough evidence in these jumbled and corrupted scriptures to recover what the faith might have been. One small but not unimportant point is noted in connection with the account of the Magi in Diogenes, who says that the Magi condemn the use of images and especially the error of those who attribute to the entities difference of sex. Yeah, the light beings, God's loyal host of angels, is genderless. That's the thing that Christians don't understand, is there's a difference between the jinn and the malaika, the light beings and the fire beings, the ahuras and the davas. And it is shown in the note upon the passage that the remark is untrue of all Zarathustra's successors, from the 7 chapters Gatha down, but it is altogether true of the prophet, for Asha, Vohumana, and Kshatra have names that are grammatically neutral, so that the feminine gender of the names Armati, Harvatat, and Amaritat is obviously not significant. Somehow it would seem that this genuine feature of the prophet's own teaching must have managed to survive, though not traceable in other sources.